Thank you for the brave ones who came to this round table, though I think it will be much more interesting than few of the panels that we had. That's because of the format. No formal papers, but a discussion. So that's the positive side. The negative side is that two of the Israeli journalists who were supposed to be here could not come. And because of that, I will deviate from my principle as a chair not to talk a lot. And I will present something about the Israeli scenery. So we'll be three of us, and we don't have much time. Let me introduce to you the two ladies who are sitting next to me, and then introduce myself as well. Following my short introduction, Gisela Dachs will present her position. She's a senior lecturer at the DAAD Center for German Studies and the European Forum of Hebrew University. She holds a PhD from the Department of Communication of Tel Aviv University, where I taught for several years. She was working as a professional journalist, including the DAAD, Libération in Paris, Neue Zürcher Zeitung, Am Sonntag, and other places. She's also lectured at the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya, the IDC, in the Tel Aviv University. Since 2001, she's the editor of the Jewish yearbook Jüdische Almanach of the Leo Baeck Institute, Jerusalem, and she is the author of several books about Israel and the Middle East. Our second participant is Gemma Porzgen, a German journalist in Berlin, specialized in foreign policy and Eastern Europe. She grew up in Moscow and Bonn, studied political science and Russian literature in Munich, and joined the German daily Frankfurter Rundschau. She became a foreign correspondent based in Belgrade and later covered Israel and the Palestinian territories for different German newspapers. Since 2006, she lives in Berlin and works for the national radio station Deutschlandfunk-Kultur. She's working as an author for different media, but also as a moderator and media consultant. She's the co-founder of Reporters Without Borders Germany, and I hope to hear something about that, and serves today as the board member. I'm Yoram Peri.
May I introduce you? You will give me the pleasure to introduce you.
I'll do it quicker.
This will be my pleasure.
I'll do it quicker.
I have just some short information about it.
All right.
That's okay. I am loud enough, I think. So I am really delighted that the moderator of this discussion is Professor Yoram Peri. Is the Abraham S. and Jack K. Chair in Israel Studies and Director of the Joseph and Alma Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies at the University of Maryland, a former political advisor to the late Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, founder and former head of Chaim Herzog Institute for Media, Politics and Society, and professor of political sociology and communication in the Department of Communication of Tel Aviv University. Welcome. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you. So I covered Israel from three angles. One, media. I was a journalist for very many years, and the latest position was editor-in-chief of a daily newspaper. From academic field, where I did political sociology. I'll tell you about two of the books which I wrote, which are related to the topics that were discussed here. And the third element, I was in politics itself. The books that I wanted to mention are two. No, just one book among many, and one article. The book is called Telepopulism, Media and Politics in Israel. And I mentioned that because today I'm working on an article on the new sort of populism, and the article will be called From Telepopulism to Digital Populism. And I wrote quite an extensive paper which was published by Halin and Mancini on their book on media systems. So if you want to know more about the Israeli media system and the changes that took place since the establishment of the state, or even before that until today, that's a paper to read. Well, I haven't prepared anything before I realize that we have short time and I have to present two other speakers. So I wrote to myself 5 points. Each one will be only 2 sentences. Number 1, related to the topic that we are discussing in these 2 days, media freedom and democracy. Israel does not have a law of freedom of the press, the First Amendment in the American context. But there is a tradition built on the decisions of the Supreme Court. So the issue of freedom of the press is quite interesting because you don't have a formal law, you don't have a law, but you have a tradition that was forced on the legislator by the Supreme Court. So the changing position of the Supreme Court reflects on that issue as well. In the past, the Supreme Court was highly appreciated. Today, it's seen as a long arm of Soros. I exaggerate a little. But the long arm of these internationalists, liberals who don't have strong feeling for the nation. So the fact that the freedom of the press is really related to the Supreme Court is problematic. Number 2, the media in Israel was in the past very strong, very strong. The media the newspapers caused Rabin to lose his position when he was prime minister the first time. Some of our prime ministers or ministers ended their career in jail because of the media. So the Israeli media is very strong. Yet something is changing lately. 3, the unique position of Israel is that it's the only democratic state in the world that has been living under permanent war since the establishment of the state. And the fact that we are constantly under permanent war has an impact on Israeli society, including the media. One of the implications, for example, is that the media, unwillingly maybe, is influenced by the politicians who said we have an enemy outside, so we have to mobilize ourselves against the enemy. The next point is that Israel is the only democracy in the world that occupies a territory. So the Israeli government is occupying foreign people. And because that has an impact on the Israeli media system. If you look at the Freedom House indexes, you will find that Israel is quite high in the index. But if you add to it the occupied territories, it moves down dramatically. So it depends how you look at Israel. Do you see Israel, small Israel, in the green line, where freedom of journalists is very high? Or if you look at Israel, including the territories, and then it goes very, very down on the list because there is censorship, the officers are, the commanders, the officers are controlling the media, there is no free media there, etc. And the last point is that since the 10 years ago or so, when we have a very right-of-center government, there's a process which I guess you discussed yesterday. Unfortunately, I couldn't be here, and where the anti-liberal tendencies are becoming stronger and stronger, and you can see that in different fields. Pressure on NGOs, pressure on the diplomats, pressure on the Supreme Court, pressure on free expression, and on the media. And particularly Netanyahu, who is the expert in media. I would advise you to invite him to any one of your universities to give a course how to use the media for political purposes. He has developed a very strong and clear policies, which he did not do before when I wrote about him as a telepopulist leader. In the last 7, 8, 9 years, he has a very, very clear policies, which is A, to control the media.
He's also the Minister of Communication.
That's right. To control the media, to influence the media, to buy the media, to put pressure on the media, to manipulate the media. And I think, and in addition to that, there's another element which I don't think happens in any other state, but I might be wrong. You'll tell me. He was, one of the reasons he became prime minister was because he had his own newspaper. Not his own newspaper, like Berlusconi and others. No, not like that. It is a free newspaper. The largest distribution of a newspaper in Israel is of Israel Hayom, Israel Today, which was established by the multi-billionaire Sheldon Adelson from United States in purpose to make Netanyahu the prime minister. And once he became prime minister, to help him. Now he's not very happy with Netanyahu, so he's moving his support from Netanyahu to Bennett, but still Netanyahu wins from that. So you have a prime minister whose words are published in a newspaper that is spread all over. Not only in the streets. If you walk in the streets, you'll find people with red uniforms giving it free, but also distributed to homes, and anyone who wants it can get it. And it's better than the newspapers, the free newspapers that used to be very popular in Europe 10 years ago. You can read it and know what's going on, but you'll know what's going on only from one side of the picture. You don't know what's going on in the entire society. So these are my points about Israeli media and developments. Later on, we can discuss more than that. So Gisela, please tell us something about you know the media in the United States, and you know the media in Israel. Give us some.
Not the United States.
Sorry, in Europe. It shows where I came from. Give us some ideas, some hints. Compare the two systems, please.
I mean, two systems I won't compare for the time we have, but maybe to be just a bit brief. Because actually the ranking of Israel, I mean, I saw the ranking in the Reporter Without Borders, and I have to say it bothered me, because there Israel ranged at the place 87, you see, far after Ghana, Togo, Mongolia, and many, many other countries. And when I see this, it's clear to me how the measurements bring this about, but I'm saying there's something wrong about that, because with all these things, I agree with Yoram, what he just said, but the Israeli media, to describe it, is much freer than that at the same time. Israelis, it's difficult to tell them to shut up. So, and this, even if you feel some more pressures on in the radio, for example, in the morning, where I feel it mostly. I mean, I'm following this scene here since 25 years. I was the exclusive correspondent of Die Zeit for 20 years. So where I feel it in the radio, in the morning, that there are simply more right-wing people interviewed. Which, in a way, if I compare it, and this is done in the name of pluralism. And you could even go now to Europe, Western Europe, not only Eastern Europe, saying, well, there is this idea also saying the media has been dominated for too long by these liberal elites. The same claim in Western Europe and in Israel. We have to also to bring the other voices there. The irony here is that Netanyahu claims this. I mean, he rose to power with this claim against the liberal elites. And he is now in power for a very, very, very long time. So he's not anymore the victim of the liberal media. Otherwise, you know, he wouldn't be where he is. So that's the irony here. But he continues to play this role, even though he has his own media. But what is similar, I would say, is this role of these liberal journalists. I mean, that are there. And their position to get also other people on air. And this is, I think, in the radio, I see it mainly, that there is a different tone there where they just invite different people. If you ask Gideon Levy, who is probably in Israel the most, by the right, most hated person, he is a commentator more than anything else in Haaretz. the left-wing, politically left-wing newspaper, economically not necessarily. That is also an Israel speciality. He will say that he has never, ever encountered any censorship when it came to his opinion. I think this is important to say. So he would be the first one to criticize the government very extremely and to go around, but he says, no, no one ever told him to shut up. There was only once, and this has been highly publicized during the last Gaza war, where he had protection for 1 day of police because he had been threatened by having accused pilots bombarding and not having no consciousness. So. But this was really half a day. I remember I've met him that day itself. So, and then he continued to do his own things. So I think that and maybe another comparison which everyone might not be aware of it. I have the impression sometimes I speak about Western Europe because I know that better. I have worked also in France. There are things I think that journalists in the West do not question where I think they should question it. I just give you an example. For every journalist who makes an interview with politicians in Germany, and if they are high politicians and ministers and chancellors, well, once you did the interview in a written matter, you will give it for authorization. And then the politicians sit there and, they rewrite answers or they cut out when they think this is not okay. And very often it brings an outlet in this position by saying, well, shall we really publish this now? This is really much more already a press release than anything else. On the other hand, it's somebody important who spoke. So let's do that. So in Israel, I have never encountered that. I remember I interviewed prime ministers, foreign ministers, and then I also said, so when do I have to submit that? And they looked at me and said, no, you don't have to. Having said that, I just found today, and I conclude with that, one might ask in a society where television is so important, referring to your book, so maybe journalists just don't interview in a written manner anymore here. And once you speak on television, so everything is really then much more under control. And here they brought out, it's called, it's a new study by Ifat Media Check and Hamash Rokit, The Whistle. Interesting, we spoke about whistleblowers. They examined dozens of statements presented as facts by Israeli politicians. And in fact, what they found out, that in many cases, they were just not precise. I give you just an example where here Yair Lapid, the head of the Future Party, claimed since the government was formed, housing prices have risen by 13% and food prices by 8%. And in fact, the housing prices have risen, but not the food prices. I mean, they just check these kind of things. Though here one has to say, okay, so it's fine then to let politicians speak freely, but the question is how much should journalists check what they say to do the fact check of what gets over here. So I think these are among the other challenges, but all over, I mean, also now, censorship is another of these subjects. If Ronen Bergman would sit here, he would speak about censorship. So censorship in Israel exists when it touches the army and the army and the army. But here again, whenever I spoke a lot in Germany also with when matters that touch the army, well, they have the same procedures. We are just in Germany not so much faced with these kind of contacts because it's not part of daily life. I mean, there are the operations in Afghanistan, but otherwise, who wants to go too much in these things? So here, this is part of the conflict, of the occupation, of the daily life of the people. So here there is censorship, even though as a foreign correspondent, I have to say, I wrote about nuclear issues, about everything. I've never submitted at any time in my life, any paper to anybody before. Where this is relevant, so it is much more, again, for television crews. And they might tell you other things about access, where to go there, a cameraman, and then also, but nowadays, I mean, you cannot stop pictures. Just imagine, 20 years ago, somebody who made a film or even did a TV reportage, he would have to get the authorization when it was touching sensitive affairs from some government here, and then to send it out. So there were procedures how to check it. Well, nowadays this is over. There's almost no way to really control what gets out. I mean, people have their mobile phones and send it out and take this over. So I think this has dramatically changed how to approach all these ideas. So I would say the only really censorship remains is when it comes to the nuclear issues. And otherwise, well, I think in very concrete situations, when we deal with asymmetric warfare or asymmetrical wars, where there the media does play a role.
Just to add one sentence about censorship, it is a military censorship. And when there were some proposals to change it, to move it to a civilian field, no one agreed to that because the Israeli public and the journalists themselves preferred it to be a military censorship because they trusted the military to look into the military affairs. While if you have it by a civilian, then it becomes a political censorship. So that's one thing. The other thing is that when Haaretz, which is the most liberal newspaper in Israel, demanded to dismantle censorship, the entire journalist corps was against it. They wanted to have the censorship because they knew that they deal with the issues of life and death, and they don't want to take responsibility for that. So they preferred to have a military censorship, and the military censorship became very liberal during, if you look at the history of the Israeli censorship, became much more liberal, again, until the last few years. Now let's move to another topic, which is not exactly the topic that we are discussing, but I think it will be interesting to ask you, how do you see the German attitudes, the German media attitudes towards Israel and the conflict? Has it changed? Is it the same? And put it in the framework of our discussion about freedom of the press, liberalism, illiberalism, etc. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, perhaps one should start with talking about foreign reporting in Germany in general, because it's a field where you see that there are less resources, which also means that there was a strength in German media sphere, I think, in having regional newspapers who had their own correspondents. I was myself covering Israel and Palestine for about 10 German newspapers who share a correspondent. It's different from big newspapers like Süddeutsche Zeitung and FAZ, who have their own exclusive correspondent. And I think there's a real a big change, because you would today still see that the big networks have their correspondents here, that you have still the big newspapers, but in regional correspondence there's less money for it, and I see that also my colleagues here in Israel have lost some of our customers, and I think there's also less interest now in Germany reading about Israel and the Palestinian conflict, because one has the feeling that's almost repeating itself, and there is more concentration on domestic topics, but on the other hand also more interest into other conflicts. For example, Turkey was a big issue in Germany, the Syrian war, and I think in the shadow of these other topics, Israel got more in the backside. And what I see as well as a difference from the time I was working here, I had a lot of space in my newspapers to report on things aside of the conflict. Which I'd liked a lot, because it was like, I saw my role as a foreign correspondent very much so that you report about the whole country. I mean, that means that you're covering sports, culture, economy, whatever else. And in German newspapers, you see there's less and less place for that, because the newspapers got much smaller, and you wouldn't have the space today to cover a lot of topics which have been covered 10 years ago. So I think there's also the danger of reducing the picture not only of Israel and Palestine, but also of a lot of other countries, to just the topics which related to crisis or wars, or conflicts. And sometimes you have also the tendency that because there is a fashion of personalization of reporting, that every country seems to have only one face. So here it would be Netanyahu, who, as if he's the whole of Israel, and in Russia it's Putin, and Turkey it's Erdogan. And I think we tend a little bit to get a more and more simplistic picture of a lot of countries because it's so much concentrated on capitals, on politicians. And especially when I read today about Israel and Palestine, it's mostly in times when things are getting hotter, and there's less about internal politics, or, as I said, about other topics, which I see as a big difference. I don't know if Gisela agrees. She's more here and seeing it from another perspective.
Do you think that with the disappearance of Angela Merkel from the political scene, there will be a change in the attitudes towards Israel?
So far, she's not disappearing. She's only disappearing from the party to be head of the party, but everything else we will see. But as we know, she has a very special relationship.
If she disappears, or when she disappears, will it make a change?
I don't know, I'm not an astrologist. I think Germany has a very special relationship to Israel, which will not change, because people, I think, are very aware of things which have happened and about the Holocaust. And I think in the remembrance of the Holocaust, in a very strange way, we were very close and related. And therefore, there is a general interest, but I'm sometimes concerned that it's very much focused on issues of the Holocaust or issues of the conflict. And I see, especially also with young people, you wouldn't find a lot people really knowing about Jewish culture, about traditions, about the history, about the culture, the literature. And I think there should be a much more broader picture of the country and of the people.
Well, on that, I would say there is a gap between, let's say, the elites, the governing elites, politicians, and from there I would say generally, I mean, the coalition and all the parties in the let's not talk about the far right or the far left. Consensus when it comes to Israel among the political elites. I would say there's a growing gap when it comes to the population in Germany and their perception of Israel, which I would say is increasingly more critical, which is not exactly at the same level. And I would even go further by saying that we have reached, in an interesting way, during the last 20 years, a stage where Israelis today are more open towards Germany than the other way around. I mean, in Israel, one knows that somebody who walks around is personally not associated. I mean, he has probably not been anymore a Nazi and a perpetrator, so one knows that the generations afterwards have a certain responsibility, but nobody would tell them, you know, you're guilty, so this is over. So, but on the other way, I mean, Germans do criticize Israel for their present. So, and I think there's an asymmetry in both relations which have come a long way. And I think when one looks at Israel, I mean, asking already the question, what Merkel, I mean, this big embracing of Merkel, who has been very, very popular in Israel and whose affection for Israel that he has shown or has been really considered as genuine. I mean, also there's a fondness of her biography, seeing her as authentic. While now in Germany she is, I mean, not out yet, but you know, it's already clear that she won't rerun again as a chancellor. So there is another asymmetry in things. I would still say that the elites, political elites, as long as there would be, I mean, also Germany, political landscape is more polarized. I mean, the center, the big parties in the center are getting like more Israeli way. So one has to see what will happen to this very, very strong German political center, which was a milestone of German post-war politics, by saying let's not have, parties too much on the right and too much on the left. We are those there.
One of the most fascinating sociological phenomena in Israel in the last 10, 15 years is the fact that the growing Israeli diaspora is in Berlin.
Yes.
When it started, most Israelis were in shock. How dare these young people go to Berlin after the Second World War and the Holocaust? Today, there's not as much criticism, and the number of young people, young Israelis who move to Berlin continues to grow from different reasons. Mainly, or the first thing was simply economy. It's very expensive to live here, much easier to buy a house and to find a job and to have an earning there. Then you have an interesting group of Israeli Palestinians, Israeli Arabs, who didn't feel, most of them are professionals, who went to Germany because it was easier for them to find good jobs. Then you have people, the last wave is of people who moved there because of politics. They are very unhappy with the politics of the Israeli government, and they move to Germany. It's like the Americans who go to Canada because of Trump. So that's a fascinating phenomenon which many people discuss.
Also party.
Right. That's right.
Forget the party.
It's not clear. It's not clear. The figures are between 20,000 to 40,000. Yeah, but it's not easy to find because many of them have also European passports, so you cannot tell. There's an article that was published in the journal that I'm the editor, Israel Studies Review, by an Israeli sociologist who did a survey on the Israelis in Berlin. But it's not clear, but it's a growing number.
Can I say something about the media angle here?
Sure.
I mean, that makes it interesting. The Israelis in Berlin, they are Israelis in Berlin. They are not immigrants to Germany, and they don't, I mean, they are really an Israeli diaspora in the reversal of the original term. And when it comes to media consumption, that is really interesting. I would say the huge majority, they don't read German, they don't consume German media. With all their critical attitude, and you're right, some of them left also, at least they say for political reasons, they would really have subscription to Haaretz, to Yediot Ochronot online. They would only consume Israeli media from far away.
They would not read Makori Shom.
That you're right, but I'm speaking about German media, about where they live there. The media of where they are. That is, usually not. I have seen one of my students did a research on that. You're right, and this even goes to the Palestinian diaspora in London, that they also read Haaretz in order to know what's going on here. That they meet each other.
There's another phenomenon now that has to do with the media, and that's the transnational media. Jews who left the Soviet Union moved to Israel, to United States, into Europe, many of them to Berlin. All three groups are reading, because of the internet, are reading Russian news outlet. And it's the first time in history that people could continue to keep their relations in spite of the fact that they live far away from each other. It never happened before, and now they can do it. And there is a research about this transnational relationship of Jews, Russian or former Russian Jews all over the world. Now, I have 15 questions to ask you, but I want to ask you only one, and then we'll leave a few minutes for questions from the audience. Tell us something about the Reporters Without Borders in Germany. Is it similar to any other group in Europe? Is it different? How important it is? What impact it has, etc.
Yeah. So as you perhaps know, Reporters Without Borders is an international organization based in France, and they started in the 80s, and we started actually in Germany in 94, so it's almost 25 years. It was just a bunch of journalists. I was one of them who had the feeling that this organization should also exist in Germany, and also in Paris there was the feeling that it should be more sections in Europe. And today, 25 years later, we are like the second biggest section in the organization. And we work very much on the German public. And to connect perhaps to what you said before, we have, for example, one of our of many fields is also that we support a lot of exile media in Germany, because the phenomenon you described as something Jewish or Russian or whatever, you see with the opportunity of internet that there are a lot of people who fled actually because of the pressures we spoke about in the last 2 days or the last day, that they have the opportunity, which is very different from the time when I started with Reporters Without Borders, that today with the internet they can really be still influential in their home countries, being a journalist. Because I always felt very sorry about colleagues who left their country and who actually lost their profession very often when they came to Germany, because media were very closed shops to strangers from other countries, even if they're colleagues, and we always try to get them into newspapers or just to ask for one article translated, and it was very difficult. And this has really changed. So one of our main fields in our work today is, for example, working on Turkey, which means also that we helped a lot of Turkish journalists to leave their country, to come to Germany, to be in a safe place. And we see several online media which are Turkish-German, also in Berlin, and who work together with Turkish journalists in Turkey, reporting about Turkey, which are read in Turkey and in Germany by a Turkish community. And you know that it's one of the biggest communities of migrant origin in Germany. So I think they're very interesting developments which we support as well. So.
I can't control myself asking one more question. In the last 7-8 years, the discussion among social scientists, philosophers, public intellectuals and others were the decline of the liberal democracy. In the last year, I can see the beginning of a new topic, and that is what will replace the illiberal democracies that exist today. So not analyzing so much what happened until now, but what will happen in the future. One of the best articles on that issue was published only a few days ago in Foreign Affairs. Give me in one sentence, give me your position. What do you think will happen in the next 5, 6, 7 years? What will replace the illiberal democracies of today?
I need to admit that I don't like the term. For me, they are democracy or not democracy, so I don't accept the term. And also, as I said, as a journalist, I'm not an astrologist. I'm used to do my research in the reality and in the facts, so I wouldn't. I still believe that we have a lot of chance to save democracy, but in my point of view, one needs as well to address certain weaknesses we have in Western democracies. And I can just say for my own country, where we have a great coalition for too many years, which hasn't been very helpful to preserve democracy.
In brackets, one of the fascinating phenomena in Israel is that a very large percentage of headlines in Israel deals with the future. Not what happened yesterday or what's happening today, but what will happen tomorrow. It is related to the fact that we live under prolonged war. And you want to know what will happen tomorrow morning. So journalists tend to write a lot about the future, to forecast about the future. The next stage of the decline of democracies.
Well, I can only say I think what needs to be done, I think for too many young people who have grown up in democracies, and this is relevant for Israel as well as for Western Europe, I think for them it's so self-evident that they don't know how to appreciate. I mean, that's just really something in all polls when this is done with millennials. And by the way, I mean, this is rather not pointing in a good direction. Millennials, meaning those who are born after 85, are more conservative ever than all the other young people before. Only with one exception, whatever it touches the LGBT subject, there they are more liberal than their parents. So I think for this young generation who grew up, in fact, with liberal values and profited, and I think they don't know probably what they will lose. Maybe once they see what they will lose, we'll have a turnaround again. Right now, I think they don't see what they have to fight for because they have it, or they still have it.
Do we have time for two questions? All right.
Thank you. I would just like to add something to this very interesting this debate about the young people in Germany. I think something which has changed recently was their appreciation for European integration. Mm-hmm. So they started to get interested in European integration and even go to the streets to rally for for Europe. This is, I think, after the shock of the Brexit, they saw that something is in danger and they should have to defend their future in terms of European future.
That's interesting because in Israel the opposite has happened. The millennials their socialization was during the second Intifada, 2005. So they were influenced by the second Intifada if they moved dramatically to the right. One of the reasons for the success of the right-wing bloc in Israel is the fact that million first-time voters moved to the right. Until 2000, the majority of them were on the left. And since then, about 80-85% of them moved to the right. And if you know that if the first-time voter continue to keep their position for a long time. So in addition to the former Russians and the Jews who came from North Africa and the religious groups, three groups, you had a fourth group, the youngest one, and all four created a shift in Israeli policy and the strong power of the right-wing camp, and that will take some time to change.
Mr. Weiss, Ambassador of Austria to Israel.
Thank you. A quick question for Gisela Dachs, because I know you know the Austrian media landscape quite well, and you were mentioning that you thought that the German public becomes more critical of Israel. When I look at the Austrian media, I remember growing up with reading Austrian media, and there were some newspapers who were super critical of Israel to a point where they were actually anti-Semitic, really. And from my experience, that has actually shifted quite a bit. I thought that at the last Gaza war, that Austrian media were very much in the middle of the road. And I would really have a hard time of pointing out any one media that is particularly critical of Austria. So for me, actually, I see quite a movement more to the middle, where Israel gets a better rap in the Austrian media, but I would be interested to see how you see that.
I mean, when I said more critical, I didn't speak about the media. I spoke about the gap between the political class and the people, and when it comes to polls and other things, not necessarily the media. I would say what happened with the media is, on the one hand, I mean, the effect of having had too much of the same. So there is, Netanyahu would say, some kind of understanding, which one can dispute whether this is really the case or not, of living with threats, that there's more understanding in Europe today. But it could also be that some of the work that has been done on analyzing, the headlines, I mean, lots of media watch criticism by saying, why when there is an attack on an Israeli, and then the attacker, the Palestinian attacker, gets shot, and then the headline is one Palestinian shot, and the context it's out. I think somehow it had maybe triggered down a little bit more that when what is seen very often from Israelis as a media bias against them in the reporting, that I think maybe things have changed, and maybe also in Germany during, I think, the wake of the refugee crisis. I mean, media was a lot criticized. By the way, for those who don't know, most of the criticism from the right was that the coverage was too positive. I mean, Germany was kind of a different, also with Austria, by the way. In Austria, this was not the case. And then the media also, I mean, this went very much along with the claim, two liberal elites in the media who And then some editors and the editor-in-chief of Die Zeit also apologized. There was a headline, welcome. So I think there was media trying to also, because readership is getting smaller, I mean, trying to be better, to be more professional. I mean, to trying to get good work out, which can be less criticized. So maybe, this is just a guess, this could be an effect on that as well, trying to be...
But usually if you have a shift of opinion in the people, then the media, someone in the media will feed to it, right?
Well, this is a question of the egg and the chicken, you know.
One more question.
One more.
Mr. George Zogopoulos, CIFE Brussels and University of Thrace, Greece.
Thank you very much for your insights. The German Chancellor has recently been very concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism in Germany, and he has appointed a commissioner to deal with the problem. I would like to ask you what you think the role of German media is in dealing with this problem.
Me?
Who wants to start? Sure, go ahead.
I'm in Germany, so...
I can, go ahead first. Yeah.
I actually had the chance to be a moderator of a roundtable just 2 weeks ago, where there were delegations coming from the whole world. Actually, there were about 15 members of Jewish organizations from very different countries, from Israel, from Australia, from Russia, whatever. And the Ministry of Family... how you say, family, wie würde man sagen? Family, whatever. Yeah, they actually invited a lot of delegations around the 9th of November to inform them about anti-Semitism. So I think what concerns the government, they are very open in trying to address these issues. And I think that's very important, and that's the same for the media. It's a huge issue in German newspaper, radio stations, and TV stations. And also there's a big discussion about figures, because so far it's mostly has been police figures, which very often don't show the real amount of incidents, because they tend, with a lot of right-wingers incidents, to actually to calculate them less than they are. So there have been new statistics now, and I think it's very important that we have the representative, who is actually a representative of Jewish life and anti-Semitism in Germany, which I find also very important, that he's actually responsible for Jewish life. And he's a person who's really following up these issues, and I think it's a good answer to the events we had.
Last word?
Yeah, I mean, Felix Klein also, he came here with Merkel. I also met him when he was here. I think this is all, I agree. But there are, when one speaks to the Jewish communities in Germany and to the rest of Germany, one has the impression Jews and non-Jews live in different worlds. I mean, the Jewish community is very, very worried and feels threatened. So this is sometimes very difficult to show exactly in terms of numbers. And then most of the Germans, probably because nobody insults them, they feel like, you know, what's all the fuss about? They don't see that there's a problem. And then Felix Klein, what he tries to do is to, with statistics a lot, to get people even being aware of that. And then the other discussion comes in here, and here this is a more media issue as well. I mean, who is to blame? Who are the anti-Semites? So it's for big part saying, well, there has always been a stable number of anti-Semites in Germany. This is not a new thing. But the taboo somehow has been lifted in a mixture of, you know, new right wings, but also migrants, not necessarily the refugees now, and it took a long time to address this, because it had been seen as really something, let's not touch this, let's not speak about that Islamic anti-Semitism. And then the question was a lot to say, well, this is only because of Israel, it's not anti-Semitic. And then there were demonstrations in Berlin right now, yesterday also again anymore, where I think that there started to be a deeper discussion about what kind of mixture is there. and how to face that, which is not an easy issue to tackle, because it goes really into something, you know, it goes, in fact, when Germany now thinks about how to integrate migrants, refugees, and the third generation of Turks who already are born there, the question comes, who are we? National narratives. And in fact, the Holocaust is such a fundamental principle for German democracy today, and the knowledge about it. So how to bring these people in there, it's a huge challenge. And they might say it's not our business, you know. But what means to be German nowadays, I think, is a discussion that has only started, where one thought 2 years, I mean, maybe one thing at the end. I remember after the second Intifada, I've given lots of talks in Germany trying to explain the situation here. And then the usual answer was from the German listeners, but you know, I don't know, these Israelis with their collective identity and nationality is so important. We have already left all this behind us. We are now post-national, no borders, we live in Europe, and we don't care about who we are. Who needs that? And why is this Israel so a latecomer in these kind of things? And when I look at things right now, I have rather the feeling that Israel was the pioneer on these kind of things, and now Europe from the West and from the East in different ways has only joined that.
6 years ago, I came from the United States and I met with one of the Israeli ministers, and I told him about the political climate in the United States when Obama was the president. And I told them, we over there live in the post-national era. You are talking to me from the past. Come on, change your position. He said, you are wrong. Unfortunately, he was right. And Israel also moved to this nationalistic style. Thank you very much to both of you. Thank you for being here.